All right, back on the record in the Simpson matter. Mr. Simpson is again present before the court with his counsel, Mr. Shapiro, Mr. Cochran, Mr. Neufeld, people represented by Mr. Darden and Mr. Harmon. Mr. Neufeld, where's Mr. Scheck? Okay, anything we can take up, any other procedural matters, or do we, I guess we need Mr. Scheck for all of our other discussions.
There's one board we had showed Mr. Scheck the other day that I don't know if you looked at. It's a report or a board that shows RFLP results only. And if you'd like, I can show it to you, and then Mr. Scheck, if there's an objection, can articulate it.
There is, or if there is?
If there is one.
Right.
I'm sure there won't be, but...
Okay. No, you don't need that, Mr. Fairlow. You can just show it to me. Aha. Want to show Mr. Scheck there?
I think it's cumulative at this point. All these results are already up and on those boards, and to put them up again and again like this, I think becomes unduly confusing. It makes it, I mean, it's hard to keep track of all the results, and if you create another board with the same results yet again, it begins to seem like there's more than there is. So I think it's a 352 problem.
All right, the title of this board is Results of RFLP DNA Analysis, and it purports to collect, Mr. Harmon, is this all the RFLP?
Except we got 117 covered up because that hasn't been reported yet, and those probes are still accumulating. That's why we have it covered up.
And this is all the RFLP testing?
That have been presented to the jury, yes, Your Honor. And the context in which, once you rule on the statistical questions that we still have to resolve, I intend to discuss degradation, contamination, cross-contamination for a short period of time, and then discuss this case with Mr. Sims as if it were an RFLP case only, and evaluate the evidence in the context of no concern for cross-contamination because of the exquisite sensitivity of PCR. You've heard the slogans all along here, but that's the context that I intend to show this board to Mr. Sims very briefly. If Mr. I mean, it is...
Well, why don't you address Mr. Scheck's two direct objections. One, that it's redundant, and two, that it has a tendency to be misleading because it seems to say that there are additional results more than what's already on the boards that we have. That's how I understand Mr. Scheck's
Yeah, and the
objection.
third one, of course, is no statistics here.
Well, it's hard to imagine how it would seem to say that there are additional results when, if that's a concern of his, I will make it clear as a foundational question for Mr. Sims that these do not represent additional results. These represent, we can dispense with that if that's the concern. You know, the term redundancy, as we discussed yesterday, may have a legal implication to you, but in the scientific context, in some of the articles, the scientific articles by Dr. Edward Blake, the question of redundancy in repeat analyses has a very positive implication that this abuses one of the notions that the defense has cleverly planted in this case. So redundancy is a very powerful word in the scientific context,
All right,
and
well, why don't you
especially in
address
this
my,
case.
my concern, Mr. Harmon?
Excuse me, Your Honor?
Why don't you address my concern?
It is not redundant in the scientific context, and therefore it should not be considered as redundant in the legal context. It is a powerful scientific redundancy that we can, if you want to put a time limit on it, I could do it in 3.5 minutes. If I overstep that, I'll be happy for you to pull the plug on me, but I think it is a powerful point that in the scientific context, that redundancy addresses all of these improbable hypotheticals.
You're still not addressing my concern, that it's cumulative, that we already have these results on other exhibits.
Well, this case is cumulative, Your Honor. It is. I mean, that's the point of this. This case is cumulative, and the fact that we have produced an accumulation of scientific results shouldn't preclude us from demonstrating the scientific redundancy. It's not irrelevant. It's not cumulative.
Well, how are you going to use this?
I will ask, I will address it after, you know, maybe the best thing to do is try to address it in the next break after you hear Mr. Sims' testimony and his extensive reliance on the publications of Dr. Blake to address this very point. Maybe that's the best thing. Let me try to lay a foundation for it, and at that point, if you want to put a time limit on, or a number limit on my questions, I'll be happy to. It's not going to take a lot of time, Your Honor.
All right, you're not going to get to this before 10:30.
I will avoid that point. Even if we do, I'll move on and then ask you to reconsider at that point.
All right. All right, we also had the issue regarding the articles that you wanted the court to consider. Mr. Harmon, do you have any other comment?
No, Your Honor, those articles speak for themselves, and they clarify the concerns that Mr. Scheck had yesterday.
I don't think they are. The one concern I had is that they already elicited testimony where they were able to multiply the D180 against the DQ alpha.
Well, I assume this is for the purposes of any motion to strike or any further remedies you might seek if the conclusions that Mr. Sims reached are not supported in the scientific literature.
No, I think that the nature of the objection was that had to do with the level of his expertise to rely on that particular document. That is different than compiling a database. In other words, if you compile a database and you do a study for one particular system, that's one thing. But to claim that he has the expertise to say that you can do a chain multiplication between systems is quite another. That one suggestion in that publication, most recently based on that data, I don't think he has the expertise to draw that additional inference. And if anyone were to do that, it would probably be a qualified population geneticist or biostatistician whom they're going to be calling. So it seems to me that it really is, I understand the court's previous ruling about these systems in place and plugging in the numbers from the database as within this witness's expertise because of the way the systems were produced and established. But I think that this is just an inference beyond which it's really fair for him to comment at this point.
It sounds like we're relitigating what was conceded now, that he's not supposed to be able to multiply. I mean, if you recall the events of yesterday, we pinpointed it during the break, and so you've already deemed him qualified to do that, and now the question that I perceive, and I know the record bears me out on this, is his sole remaining objection was the independence of these markers, and those articles specifically address that. And so the sole question, the burning question of yesterday was, could he multiply the cell markers by the D1S80 markers? And that question was based on Mr. Scheck's representations that they may not be independent, not that Mr. Sims was not qualified. I appreciate why it's painful to hear this stuff, but that was the issue yesterday, and I think that's the only issue that we addressed in those articles, and the articles are clear.
My point is this: he's not qualified to make the assessment based on this one article recently produced in this context. I understood the court's previous rulings, looking at all this literature and all the foundation and all the cases, was that if, and the foundation that was laid, is that if you have a system which they've created a database, there's been a number of publications and studies, and he is a user, essentially, of the database, and the system that's presented to him can say, I've scored this band, or I've recognized this allele, and I go to some published table, and I can generate numbers based on that published table, that was a sufficient foundation in the way the courts were ruling it. His expertise is sufficient to do that. When you're now asking to conduct a chain multiplication of different marker systems, I don't think that this is an adequate foundation in terms of this witness's expertise to evaluate this literature and say it's okay to do this additional chain multiplication. And I think it's evident from the way the numbers rapidly escalate that it's no small matter to say that let's do a chain multiplication of frequencies on the order of 1 in 10 for DQ alpha, then we'll multiply them in a chain multiplication against D1S80 and then polymarkers, and all of a sudden you're looking at much rarer frequencies than you started with. So that is a leap that I don't think this witness is within the foundational parameters this court has set out is qualified to make.
All right, thank you. All right, the objection will be overruled. And Mrs. Robertson, let me ask you to mark these articles that were submitted to the court as court's exhibits for the purpose. Mr. Darden? Do we have to now?
I'm curious.
You're curious? I'm curious about a lot of things. Do we have to do this right now rather than take a jury time? Does it have something to do with Mr. Harmon's presentation?
No, it doesn't.
Okay, let's have the jury. We'll take it up at the break.
May I ask for the jury to be allowed to be heard on the most recently filed motion?
Not now.
I knew that.
Today at 4:30?
Okay.
All right.
Or tomorrow.
Let the record reflect that we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And counsel, for your information, Mrs. Robertson advises me that the two buzzes this morning, which on the court's buzzer system indicates the jury has a question. The jury wanted to bring to the court's attention the fact that a article in a publication regarding this case had slipped through the censors, and that one of the jurors had seen it and immediately brought that to the attention of the court. And Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for your diligence in this matter. All right, Mr. Sims, would you please resume the witness stand, please? We'll isolate what it is and show it to counsel at the break. All right, good morning, Mr. Sims.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Mr. Sims, you're reminded, sir, you are still under oath, and Mr. Harmon, you may continue with your direct examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Sims, before we complete the calculations for some of the frequencies that we hadn't gotten to yesterday, are you familiar with through the FBI World Population Study, a large amount of Hay3, the restriction enzyme you use, population data that could be searched for the profiles that were produced in this case?
Objection, Your Honor. 1054, beyond the scope of what we had agreed to with respect to this witness.
Let me see the counsel with the call, please. All right, thank you, counsel. Proceed.
Mr. Sims, do you recall the question I asked you?
Yes.
Are you familiar with that study in the context that I described it in the question?
Yes.
Okay. Could we have the SOC photo board and the SOC result board? The photo board is 262A, and the result board is 262.
Mr. Fairlow, is it possible to raise the second exhibit?
A little bit, Your Honor, but not much.
All right, why don't you raise it as high as you can?
just going to go in the order that these stains, the numerical order that they're listed there, and initially discuss the significance of the 11 probe RFLP match that on DOJ 42A1, SOC 13, the Greg Matheson cutout stain, okay?
Okay.
How did you approach your calculations to this 11 probe or 11 genetic marker match between Nicole Brown and the cutout that Greg Matheson made from SOC A?
The approach that I used was to go to the bin tables. Those are the tables that list the frequencies for these RFLP bins or alleles within the bins. And I made a determination based on 6 loci.
Okay, and what significance, so when you say 6 loci, you mean 6 probes,
6 probes,
6 genetic markers.
6 genetic markers.
What significance do those other 5 probes that you did not use in your calculations have in giving the jury some appreciation for how common or rare this match is?
Yes, the idea is that these additional systems are also highly polymorphic. They have great powers of exclusion, and so I looked at those additional loci to check the results of the SOC against the reference sample.
In normal English, could you tell us what highly polymorphic means?
It means that if you were to take 2 individuals at random, there would be a very good likelihood that you'd be able to separate them based on this type of analysis. Any one of those probes is very strong for that purpose.
People are pretty different from one another.
Yes, they are.
As you demonstrated on all of the autorads when it was easy to distinguish from among the 3 reference sources.
You know, bleeding, argumentative.
Sustained.
Let's get to them.
Could you, just the way we approach the other statistics, could you describe from among the 3 major population groups that you've used in your calculations the frequency estimate for those 3 groups and the match between Nicole Brown's reference blood and Greg Matheson's cutout stain on the sock?
Yes. For those, the 6 loci that I looked at, these are RFLP loci D1S7, D2S44, D4S139, D5S110, D10S28, and D17S79. The profile detected in stain 42A1 occurs in approximately 1 in 21 billion Caucasians, 1 in 41 billion African Americans, and 1 in 7.7 billion Hispanics, again indicating that this profile is a rare event and pointing out that these are for unrelated individuals.
Now, is there any way to express to the jury what impact those other probes that do those other genetic markers that have not played a role in your calculations have on describing how common or rare the pattern of Nicole Brown's blood is when you look at it and see it in the sock?
Objection, irrelevant.
Sustained.
Would you please relate to the jury, in your opinion, the impact on those numbers that you've just communicated to the jury in helping them evaluate how common or rare that pattern is?
Objection, irrelevant.
I'm going to sustain an objection to that question because I think the statistic itself speaks for itself. How common or rare?
Thank you, Your Honor. Do each of those additional tests narrow down the possibilities?
Certainly.
Specific objection to these probes.
Which are we talking about, the 6 or the 5?
Do each,
Sustained.
I'll rephrase it, thank you, Your Honor. Do each of the additional genetic markers that do not play a role in those calculations that you've just presented to the jury, do they have an impact on those calculations?
Overruled.
Yes, they do.
And just in general terms, could you explain that to the jury?
Well, as I started to say earlier, these tests are very good at distinguishing between individuals. And so what we're looking at is more and more genetic markers, more and more places on the chromosomes where we see whether or not a given stain and a given reference sample match. And the more of those that one looks at, the rarer the profile must become.
And, okay. In addition to those 11 genetic markers, your laboratory performed PCR tests on that same stain. Is that right?
Yes.
And the results you've already described, DQ alpha 1.1, 1.1, D1S80, 18.
Yes.
What I'd like you to, have you been provided data based on cell marks analysis of extracted DNA from the very same stain that you extracted, which demonstrates the commonness or uncommonness of the PCR results in this case?
Yes.
And have you also considered the population data that you have for the PCR markers that your laboratory used in testing the exact same DNA in this case?
Yes.
Okay. Is it possible for an expert to calculate the combined frequency of the polymarker inclusion, those 5 genetic markers, the DQ alpha inclusion by cell mark, your DQ alpha inclusion, and your D1S80 inclusion, so that you could describe to the jury the commonness or rarity of the match between those PCR markers and the stain that Greg Matheson cut out from that sock?
Yes.
Okay. Have you done that?
Yes, I have.
Okay. Would you please then describe to the jury in the same way that we have? You know, I forgot to have you write up the RFLP results. So when we do the PCR results, let's do the RFLP statistics too. Could you please express to the jury the calculation for the frequencies between, and the PCR markers matches between cell mark and the Department of Justice?
Yes. Would you like me to step to the board to
If
do
you
that?
just describe that, and then I'll ask you to write in both of those slots there. We've got a patch for one of those boards.
Mr. Harmon, let me ask a clarification question.
Sure.
You mentioned DQ alpha twice
Right. What I
by
was,
both labs. I assume we're only calculating this once.
that's correct. I was going to ask that after we got it up there.
All right, I wanted to
I'll
make-
clarify that in a moment if I
Okay.
could. Do you want to go up there and write out, once you write out the RFLP, if there's enough room for that, and I've got a cover for the PCR.
Please approach for just a second on the related issue.
Yeah, with the court board, please. right, thank you, counsel. Mr. Harmon, excuse me, Mr. Sims, have you completed your writing?
Your Honor, I wanted the record to reflect, we have a patch to put over Cellmark's PCR calculations, a magnetic patch, because these will represent, as Mr. Sims described, a different calculation.
All right, and pursuant to our discussions, you'll clarify this question?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right.
Okay, may the record reflect on Exhibit 262, I'm putting a patch over Cellmark's PCR calculations to allow Mr. Sims an opportunity to present the cumulative calculations that he's just described. Could you write up the cumulative calculations and the PCR markers between your laboratory and Cellmark, and then we'll clarify.
Well, let's have a clarification
Okay.
before we write it.
Sure. Now, your laboratory did one of the same markers that Cellmark did, DQ alpha, is that correct?
That's correct.
You didn't count that twice in the multiplication, did you?
No, I did not.
That would not be proper.
That would be very improper.
Okay. Is that clear, Your Honor?
Is there any other overlap with any of the other probes that we use?
Oh, in the RFLP context,
No, in this PCR context.
is there any other overlap
No,
between
Your
any of the other PCR markers? So, and this is purely the cumulative frequency of the combined PCR test results between your laboratory and Cellmark on the Greg Matheson cutout from SOC number 13.
Yes, this would be for the 5 polymarker test plus DQ alpha plus D1SA.
Okay, would you write the more common frequency and then 2, the less common frequency or least common frequency from among these 3 groups? And you've got 1 in 50,000 to 1 in 6 million. What groups do those represent, and then what is the other group? I guess we haven't explained that to the jury.
The 1 in 50,000 figure comes from the Caucasian data. The 1 in 6 million comes from the African American data. And then finally, I calculated an Hispanic figure, and that was 1 in 150,000.
Okay, Mr. Sims, why don't you stay up there while you're there? We're going to go through the other SOC stains, starting with your number 42A on SOC 13A in the leg area. What is the frequency for the DQ alpha D1S80 match, which is consistent with the defendant? And the same 3 groups.
Same 3 groups.
Yes, please.
For the African American group, it would be about 1 in 570. For the Caucasian group, about 1 in 520. And for the Hispanic group, about 1 in 1,400.
Okay, could you write the least common from among those 3 to the most common?
Okay.
Or the most common to the least common, please? Okay, and would that frequency be the same for the next SOC 42A3 from SOC 13A, the leg areas? It's the same results? Would that be the same frequency?
Yes, it would.
1 in 520 to 1 in 1,400?
Yes.
Would you write that down, please? And the next stain produce the same results? Would it produce the same sort of frequency estimate?
Yes.
Same range, 1 in 520 to 1 in 1,400?
Yes, this would be 42A4.
42A4, yes.
Yes.
Would you write that down, please? Now, the next 2 stains, 42B1 and 42B2, produce the same results, is that correct? 42B1 and 42B2, those are your numbers
Yes.
from, this is the other sock now, the one with all the tiny dots on it?
This is the other SOC, yes.
Okay. Did you calculate a frequency for the results in that sock?
Yes.
And what is the range of frequencies, and describe the groups that those frequencies come from?
Okay, this would be for the DQ alpha type 1.1, 1.1, with the D1S80 type 1818. The frequencies would range as follows. I'll give the three groups. The African American calculation is 1 in 8,900. The Hispanic calculation is 1 in 1,300. And the Caucasian calculation is 1 in 990.
Okay, could you write from the most common to the least common, please? Okay, could we move on to the Bundy photo board and the Bundy result board? Photo board exhibit 165 and the Bundy result board 259. Mr. Sims, we're going to shift gears and talk about the combined PCR frequencies for several items that you discussed yesterday. Those are item 47. These are LAPD items, and the first four are from the Bundy walkway: 47, 48, 50, and 52. And then after that, I'll ask you to do your calculations for the combined frequencies between your lab and Cellmark on the three nail items from Nicole Brown. Okay?
Okay.
Could we lower that down, because we're going to start at the top? Is that okay, Your Honor? And we'll move it up as we can. Okay, Mr. Sims, let's start at the top. Item number 47 on the Bundy walkway, the first drop that you analyzed closest to the victims. Did you calculate a combined frequency for Cellmark's polymarker results and DQ alpha results, which included Mr. Simpson as a possible source of that, and your DQ alpha D1S80 results?
Yes.
And in doing so, again, did you not use the DQ alpha results twice?
I did not use the DQ alpha results twice.
Because that would be improper.
That would be improper.
Okay. Could you express to the jury what the combined frequency, based on those your calculations, for the three groups that we've been using consistently here?
Yes, the figures are as follows. For the Caucasian group, it would be 1 in 1.8 million. For the African American group, 1 in 240,000. And for the Hispanic group, 1 in 2.2 million.
Okay. Your Honor, may the record reflect, I'm going to put a cover over Robin Cotton's calculations, and Mr. Sims, why don't you write down as we have from the most common to the least common among the three groups that you just described.
Actually, what you might do is allow him to write on the covers and then put it up.
Good idea. Thank you. Right, would that? Sure. Sure. Go ahead and write. You want to do that one down here? Sure. Okay, why don't you put it up there and we'll move on to 48. Okay, and 48, the results are the same as in 47, are they?
Yes, they are.
1 in 240,000 to 1 in 2.2 million?
Yes.
Would you write that on the patch, and can we put the patch on the board now?
Yes.
Wrong. No, that's right, I'm sorry. Item number 50, that's another item that you and Cellmark both tested for the same PCR markers as 47 and 48. That's another Bundy block stain.
Yes.
Same results, same calculations.
Yes.
Would you write that down on the patch, and when you're done, put the patch up on item number 50? Okay. We need a little patch on one of our patches, Your Honor, if I could have a moment. Okay, and if you, would you look at the result chart and item number 52, there's not a lot of space over there. Did you produce the same PCR cross-lab multiplication for 52 that you produced for 50, 48, 47?
Yes.
And what are those numbers?
Again, that range would be 1 in 240,000 to 1 in 2.2 million.
Okay, and that doesn't change the RFLP result or estimate that Robin Cotton is written in there, is that correct?
No, those RFLP results are a separate calculation.
I'll move on, if I can come back to that when we've got the patch ready, Your Honor. I'll move on to items, the 84 group of items. Okay, Mr. Sims, you've described to the jury the results of your testing, and on items 84, the 3 items yesterday from Nicole Brown's nail scrapings from both hands and nail clippings. Did you perform calculations for the combined frequencies of the results that Cellmark produced on that for their testing for polymarker and DQ alpha, which included Nicole Brown, and then combine them with your D1S80 results?
Yes.
And what are the results of your calculations? What are the frequency estimates for those 3 groups?
Excuse me. This would be for now the polymarker, 5 polymarker loci, DQ alpha, and then D1S80. And the results would be for the Caucasian group 1 in 50,000, for the African American group 1 in 6 million, and for the Hispanic group 1 in 150,000.
I'm handing you the patch for item 84A. Would you write down those combined frequencies and put them over in the right-hand column?
Okay.
And are these calculations the same for all three items? The scrapings from the left hand, the clippings from the right hand, and the scrapings from the right hand?
Yes.
Okay, why don't I give you the three separate patches so you can put the number down all at the same time? Okay, place the patch over on 84A to the right over the, it's your DOJ DNA 46B. And then the other two patches are a little bit smaller. Could you put them over your 45A1B from the right-hand clippings? And then your 45B, the right-hand scrapings. Okay, Mr. Sims, you can go back to your seat. Or no, we still have 52. Okay, Mr. Sims, we've got some patches on patches. Could you write down the PCR combined frequency for item 52 that dropped out in the driveway? Just the PCR testing that was done between DOJ and Cellmark on that stain. Okay, thanks, Mr. Sims. Okay, Mr. Sims, I'd like to shift gears if I can and talk about the possible effects of contamination on PCR versus RFLP, okay?
Okay.
You've already told us that you've relied on the, can we take those boards down, Your Honor?
Yes.
Thank you. You've already told us that you rely on the scientific literature regularly in forming opinions.
Yes, I do.
I think you're going to see, we're going to get in an area we agreed we would approach on beforehand, so.
Proceed.
Well, I don't
Proceed.
think we are. Okay.
Proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. What journals do you read? Scientific journals?
Well, I read a variety of them. In the forensic literature, I read the Journal of Forensic Sciences, the Journal of Forensic Science Society, the American Journal of Human Genetics. There's a variety of other journals that relate to DNA testing and also to the forensic use of DNA testing.
And how frequently do those journals come out, average?
Some of them are monthly, some of them are 6 times a year,
And is this a rapidly evolving area?
very rapidly.
In what sense?
Well, the technology in DNA technology is evolving at a very incredible rate. To me, it's much like computer technology. It's rapidly evolving, and what happens is the advances that come about in molecular biology and genetics are then transferred to the forensic level, and so we're all evolving very rapidly.
Okay. Hey, we're gonna go through some of the articles, and I want to ask you initially whether you've read and relied upon them, which is the key word, informing any of the opinions that you're about to express, okay?
Okay.
Have you shared these items with Mr. Scheck?
Yes, sure.
And that's why.
All right, let me see council sidebar with the report. All right, thank you, counsel.
Okay, Mr. Sims, I'm going to read off the names and titles of several articles and ask you if you read and consider them, and then we'll go through them in certain areas, okay?
Okay?
Have you read an article by Comey and Bedoli entitled Validation Studies on the Analysis of the HLA DQ alpha locus using the polymerase chain reaction?
Is that November 91 Journal of Forensic Sciences?
Yes, it is.
Yes, I've read that.
And Bedoli is Budowle. Have you also read and relied upon, in the subjects we'll be discussing soon, a chapter in a book entitled PCR Technology, Principles and Applications for DNA Amplification, Henry Ehrlich, editor, Chapter 17. The title is Applications of PCR to the Analysis of Biological Evidence.
Yes, I have.
The authors are Cecilia von Beroldingen, Beroldingen, Edward Blake, Russell Higuchi, Higuchi, George Sensabaugh, Sensabaugh, and Henry Ehrlich.
Yes.
Have you also read and relied upon an article in the Journal of Forensic Science entitled Polymerase Chain Reaction Amplification and Human Leukocyte, Leukocyte, antigen, oligonucleotide, oligonucleotide, typing on biological evidence samples, casework experience?
Is that the one with Blake as the lead author?
Yeah, it's the authors are Edward Blake, Jennifer Mihalovich, Mihalovich, Russ Higuchi, Sean Walsh, and Henry Ehrlich.
Yes.
Have you also read and relied upon, in the testimony we'll be presenting soon, an article entitled Analysis of Genetic Markers in Forensic DNA Samples Using the Polymerase Chain Reaction in Analytical Chemistry, 1991. The authors are Rebecca Reynolds, George Sensabaugh, and Edward Blake.
Yes.
Have you read and relied upon a chapter in Forensic Science Handbook, Volume 3 by Richard Saferstein, 1993, entitled DNA Analysis in Biological Evidence, Applications of the Polymerase Chain Reaction by George Sensabaugh and Edward Blake?
Yes.
Have you also read and relied upon an article entitled, or a chapter entitled, Applications of the Polymerase Chain Reaction in Forensic Science, the authors of which are Russell Higuchi and Edward Blake, and that's in the Banbury Report, number 32?
Yes, I have.
Okay, Mr. Sims, are you, let's focus on PCR for a moment. Is it your opinion that a typing error in the PCR process is more likely to result in a false exclusion than an inclusion?
Yes.
Okay. And have you read and considered and relied upon the casework article for that proposition?
Yes. As well as my own understanding.
Could you explain the basis for your opinion that a typing error in the PCR process is more likely to result in a false exclusion than an inclusion?
Yes, the basis for that is that if one obtains a result that is a false positive, then that sort of result would be more likely to say, to exclude somebody than to include somebody in most instances.
Could you be a little more descriptive of how that might occur during the PCR typing process?
I would object that this is vague and without foundation at this point.
Overruled.
Well, for example, if one were to test a given blood stain against a particular individual may, his or her type may occur, say, in 1 in 10 or something like that, maybe 1 in 20 with the DQ alpha, for example. And so if you're generating at random wrong results, then it's unlikely that it would match that particular individual. It's more likely that it would match, the type would be to match somebody else.
Motion to strike.
Overruled.
Okay. Mr. Sims, is it your opinion that the application of PCR technology in the forensic context is in any way different than it is in the diagnostic context?
Objection. No foundation for this one.
Sustained.
Mr. Sims, is it your opinion that any of the properties of forensic DNA samples are unique, or strike that? Is it your opinion that any of the properties of the kinds of forensic samples that your lab encounters are unique to forensic science or different than clinical setting?
Objection.
Foundation. Sustained.
Mr.
You asked him
Sims?
some questions about his familiarity with.
Sure. Are you familiar in a general context with the kinds of, or have you read the casework article?
Yes.
Okay. Would it help to refresh your recollection? Is that discussed, the uniqueness or the difference of forensic samples in the casework article, the lead author of which is Edward Blake?
Objection. The foundation is to this witness's expertise to review that point.
Overruled.
Your question again, please.
The question about whether forensic samples are different than clinical samples.
That's clinical.
Overruled.
Is it discussed in that article?
Yes, I believe it is. as I
Okay.
recall.
Would it help to refresh your recollection if you reviewed? I can direct you to a page in that article if you would.
Yes.
Page 721, can I show it? Be on page 721 if you'd read the paragraph
My
on the bottom.
objection is
I know. What's your objection? What's the legal grounds?
no
One word.
foundation for this witness to,
Overruled.
what, can I state it?
Overruled.
No,
Sit
the
down.
fa- Well, all right.
Yes, excuse me, what Dr. Blake and the other,
No, the question is, does that refresh your recollection as to whether or not there's any correlation between the medical diagnostic application or the forensic application?
yes, it does refresh my recollection.
Next question.
And do you have an opinion on that subject?
Yes, I do.
And
His opinion.
Overruled.
Can I also have which page you're referring
721,
of which article now?
towards the bottom of the casework article?
Which one? 721?
Yes.
Proceed.
Oh, I'm sorry, Your Honor. Do you have an opinion on that subject?
Yes, the point of this is that forensic samples may be mixtures, they may be degraded, but these kinds of samples are also encountered by clinical workers using PCR technology.
Objection, move to strike this answer, this witness's answer about what's found in clinical technology.
Overruled.
And is your opinion based on having your recollection refreshed by reading the bottom of page 721 of Dr. Blake's casework article?
Well, I already had some opinion on that, but specifically with regards to the article, yes.
Okay. Now, just as an aside, have you read the NRC report that came out 3 years ago?
Yes, I have.
Have you relied on the NRC report in any way for any of the opinions you've expressed to this moment?
No.
And do you intend to rely on the NRC report in any way for any of the opinions you'll express for the next several moments?
No.
Could I have my book back? Could you define, as best you can, the term contamination in the crime scene forensic DNA context so the jury can appreciate the discussion we're going to have?
Yes, there are a variety of ways of looking at contamination. One would be fundamentally, for example, at a crime scene where you may have mixtures of bodily fluids. Blood from two different individuals could land together, that sort of thing, or end up in a garment situation. That would be one form of contamination. Another form of contamination would be the concern one would have in the laboratory. In other words, if somebody is mishandling samples, then that could lead potentially to contamination as one DNA is transferred to another DNA. And then finally, the type of contamination that we are most worried about with PCR and that we have to take special precautions for is what is called PCR product contamination. And that's because this process of PCR, as Dr. Cotton explained, generates large numbers of these DNA segments that are of a particular short length that are considered to be PCR product now. And by generating those large numbers, you want to make sure that that material doesn't in any way contaminate your original source material or your extracted DNA.
And do you have an opinion about whether or not, generally speaking, there are adequate ways to control against those three areas of contamination?
Well,
Objection to the question.
I think there's two responses here. One is that there are ways to control for the contamination. There are also ways of monitoring for that contamination. And both of those are important aspects with regards to contamination, both the monitoring as well as the precautions.
And I want to direct your attention to the chapter by Simpson Blake in the Saferstein article. Is the subject of those areas of contamination, which you've just described for the jury, is that discussed in that article?
Yes, it is.
Okay, do you remember the entire discussion that occurs on pages 441 and 442 of that subject?
I haven't memorized it, but I have a good knowledge of what they say.
Okay, would it help to refresh your recollection to review that?
Yes.
You had a chance to review that?
Yes.
And so what is your opinion specifically about the kinds of controls that can safeguard against those forms of contamination?
My opinion about the types of controls?
Sure.
Well, they basically, their words basically mirror the things that I was talking about where they, for example, they mention maintaining clean work areas, using gloves, changing gloves, that sort of thing. And then also they stress which controls should be run. They draw an analogy to the types of precautions that would be taken in an infectious disease situation or a laboratory handling infectious materials.
And do you have an opinion, based on your review of that article, that should contamination occur, it can be recognized?
Yes, in most cases it can.
And is that based on the article as well?
Yes.
Is this in context? Well,
shift to another article that I described earlier in PCR Technology, Chapter 17, by Von Bereldingen, Blake, Higuchi, Sensabaugh, and Ehrlich. Do you have an opinion about whether or not the most likely avenue for chance introduction of foreign DNA is during sample preparation?
I would agree with that.
Okay. And do you have an opinion, or is it your opinion that common sense precautions can safeguard against that?
Yes.
Okay. And do you recall whether or not that subject is discussed in the article I just described as Chapter 17?
Yes, that chapter has a good discussion of the contamination issue.
Okay. And do you agree that the presence of a contaminant is often readily apparent?
Yes.
Is it also your opinion that appropriate controls should be used that would indicate these situations of contamination?
Absolutely.
Sustained.
What opinion do you have, if any, about whether or not appropriate controls should be used that would indicate these situations of contamination?
The opinion I have is that those controls should always be run to monitor for contamination.
And what opinion, if any, do you have about whether or not negative controls, including extraction reagent blanks and unstained substrate controls, when possible, should be run for each batch of DNA isolations?
I agree with that, and that's what we do in my laboratory.
And what opinion do you have about whether or not the absence of a PCR product in these control reactions attests to the validity of the typing results derived from the evidence samples?
I would agree with that.
Do you have an opinion about whether or not it is desirable to have some form of redundant sample analysis in a given case?
I would agree it's desirable.
And generally speaking, do you recall whether or not those subjects are discussed in Chapter 17 that I've been referring to?
Yes, I know that chapter quite well.
Okay, but do you have it memorized?
No.
Would it help to refresh your recollection? I'll direct you to pages 215.
He hasn't indicated that his memory needs to be refreshed as to anything so far.
Do you remember whether or not those questions I just asked you specifically are addressed the way I asked you?
I believe those are in there, but it would refresh my memory to be sure that they're in there.
215, 216?
This is really not an appropriate way to refresh somebody's recollection. I don't believe it to be necessary at this point. Proceed.
Okay, and it's your recollection those are discussed in Chapter 17 that I just...
Yes.
Mr. Sims, let's talk about the validation study that we discussed at the very beginning by Comey and Bedoli.
Yes.
You have that one clear in your mind? You remembered it was November 91?
Yes.
And I just want you to focus for a moment on the was there a sample handling part of that study that's published and described in detail?
Yes, there was that was a major part of that article, or an important part of that article.
Okay, and do you rely on that in the way you perform your PCR analyses?
Yes.
Does it help you in deciding what safeguards to take against in-lab contamination or sample preparation contamination to rely on that?
Yes, it does.
And what is your opinion about sample-to-sample contamination in the laboratory? Is it possible for that to occur?
Is it possible?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
Okay, and the opinion that you've expressed is actually based on where that was demonstrated in that article, is that correct?
Yes, and
Objection vague as to samples, what kind of laboratory?
Okay, let's just open it up. What kinds of samples were handled in that case, and what sorts of conclusions were drawn from the possibilities of sample handling error?
Objection vague foundations, which case?
Compound.
Do you have an opinion about the kinds of sample handling errors that can occur that can allow samples to cross-contaminate one another?
Objection vague.
yes,
And is that opinion based on the sample handling portion of the casework article?
well, and also our own experience in the laboratory with PCR and the experience of many other people using PCR.
Okay, let's focus on the article and what your opinion is based on having read the article. What sorts of sample handling errors, is it your opinion, can produce sample-to-sample contamination?
The sorts of concerns would be, for example, in that article, they mentioned 2 wet blood stains being brought into contact with each other. That would be one example. There are other instances they attempted to deliberately contaminate certain stains in those articles, and they had difficulty doing that with blood stains of sufficient quality and quantity of DNA. They also did some samples where they looked at saliva and blood and that sort of thing, and how that might affect the contamination issue. I think the last thing one of the other things they looked at was whether or not cutting with scissors, cutting a blood stain, whether or not those scissors would transfer contamination.
Okay, let's focus on, there's actually a table that describes, in the Comey article, that describes their efforts to force samples to contaminate one another.
Yes, they list several scenarios in that table.
And based on having read that article alone, what sorts of sample-to-sample contamination were they able to induce?
As I recall, they were able to induce it when blood stains were brought into contact with each other, actually touching each other. They were able to induce it with mixtures of saliva and blood, for example.
Okay, let's take those one at a time. When you say touching one another, are you referring to the dried stains that were stored together?
Well, I think they had a low-level, detectable low-level contaminant when dry. It was more of a problem when they're wet and touching each other, which one would obviously expect.
Okay, when you say touching, do you mean stored?
Stored together, yes.
In other words, put together and kept together?
That's my understanding.
Would it help to refresh your recollection if you looked at page 1639 of the article?
Yes.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, and let's just talk about in that sample handling study, the 2 top categories, dried stains stored together and wet stains stored together.
Yes.
What were the results of those attempts to force cross-contamination?
Well, what they did was they took blood from 2 different sources, dried stains from 2 different sources, and tested one and then tested the other to see which one may have contaminated the other. And with one of those, they saw no exchange. With the other one, they saw that there was a trace contaminant of one of the alleles onto the other stain.
Okay, and does the article describe how long they were actually stored together?
I don't recall them actually mentioning the time.
Okay.
I think it just mentions that they were stored together.
And you mentioned also, give us a general idea of what sorts of other experiments, sample handling experiments, the study was based on, where they tried to force cross-contamination between samples that were ultimately typed using the PCR DQ alpha system?
Yes. For example, they looked at the effects of perspiration. They didn't find any contamination from that. They also looked at small 1 microliter blood stains that they were handling, and they did not find any contamination from that. They had a small 1 microliter blood stain that they coughed over for 1 minute. And that produced no contamination. And by that I mean they know the type of the blood stain, they know the type of the cougher, and so they look to see whether or not the cougher's type ends up on the blood stain. They also did an experiment where they took small 1 microliter blood stains and scratched their head for 30 seconds to shed their dandruff over it to see if that would cause a contamination problem, and it did not. Then they also did some experiments where they actually mixed blood and saliva, and there, as one would expect, you could get a contamination. You would see the types from the blood and the saliva.
Okay. I think you used the word transfer or evidence transfer. What are we, or trace transfer? What, in this discussion, what do you mean by that?
Well, what I'm talking about is whether or not small contributions of contamination would show up in a blood stain.
And based on that study, the only 2 areas of trace transfer were wet stains stored together for some period of time.
Objection, leading.
Sustained.
Based on that study, were the only instances of
Objection, leading.
typable DNA evidence transfer.
Sustained.
Okay. But the scissors, contaminated scissors, what was that again?
Yes,
Objection asked and answered.
Oral.
the blood stain was cut with scissors and the contamination was not detected. In other words, as I read the article, 2 stains in a row were cut with these scissors, and the scissors, after cutting the first stain's type did not show up in the second.
Okay. Mr. Sims, let's shift a little bit here, and let's talk about substrate controls in the context of the Comey article and in the context of the work that you did in this case, okay?
Okay?
Could you define a substrate control in the context of the kinds of samples that you typed in this case?
Yes, a substrate control, for example, if we talk about blood drops on a sidewalk, one would want to collect the blood stain and then to collect and sample an area, unstained area where there was no blood detected nearby the blood stain. That's a substrate control. So you're testing that particular substrate and you're testing it very close to where the blood stain is.
Okay, and then processing it as if it were a stain?
Yes, and then it goes through the entire process and you look to see if there's any types showing up in that substrate control.
Okay, and I believe a little while ago, relying on one of the Blake Sensabaugh articles, you defined 3 areas of sample cross-contamination?
Yes,
And it's my recollection, sample mixing in the field,
yes,
contamination by investigators or by lab personnel?
Leading. Sustained.
What were those 3 categories again?
I mentioned the contamination in the field, in other words, mixed samples occurring in the field. I mentioned contamination occurring in the laboratory as these samples are either processed or extracted. And then finally, I mentioned PCR product contamination.
And that's after the PCR is amplified?
Yes.
Okay. Let's talk about the field sample mix-up. And what I want to do is discuss the implications of having substrate controls collected systematically in the field, okay?
Okay.
And the question is, if a criminalist systematically alternated between substrate controls and stains in the evidence collection process, what effect, if any, does the presence or the availability of the substrate control have as a safeguard against sample mix-up?
It's an important safeguard because it shows to me, if the substrate controls turn out to be negative, it shows to me that there is no cross-contamination from sample to sample. Because of the alternating structure of that collection process, one has a stain, then a substrate control that should turn up negative, then another stain, then another substrate control. So that monitors that between each one of those stains, you've got one of these substrate controls. And if that shows negative, then that indicates that you're unlikely to have contaminated the blood stains on either side of that control.
Okay. What effect, let's focus on the same context, as a safeguard against sample mix-up in the field, what effect does just simply collecting one stain at a time with its substrate control have as a safeguard against sample mix-up in the field?
Yes, I think that's an important safeguard because it means you're focused on one particular event and you're not likely then to be handling too many samples at once. You're just keeping track of one item at a time.
Let's move to the next category that you described, and that is contamination by investigators or laboratory personnel.
Okay.
Okay. What effect does the presence of substrate controls, which type clean, do not produce a type, have as a safeguard against contamination by investigators or laboratory personnel?
Well, those are very important because you have to remember that if those are negative, in other words, they have no DNA, they're even more vulnerable to this contamination showing up than would a good blood stain be. In other words, a good blood stain might have so much DNA that you may not even see a trace amount of contamination with this PCR testing. But these substrate controls, if they're negative to begin with, they have no DNA, they're certainly going to be more vulnerable to showing any traces of contamination. So that's why they're important.
Okay. As long as they test clean,
As long as they test clean.
as they did in this case.
As all of the ones that we tested were negative, yes.
Okay.
All right, Mr. Harmon, we need to take our break at this point. All right, ladies and gentlemen, please remember all of my admonitions to you. Do not discuss this case amongst yourselves. Do not form any opinions about the case. Do not conduct any deliberations till the matter has been submitted to you. Do not allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case, and we'll be in recess for 15. Newspaper article that the jurors brought to the court's attention appeared in a little blurb column regarding counsel's comments about various basketball teams. Did not go to the merits of the case, and I find this no harm, no foul. But I think it speaks to the diligence and integrity of our jurors, so I will convey to them the court's compliments. I take it there's no other comment or objection on behalf of the parties.
Your Honor, may I just make one inquiry? Have there been any other articles any other time since it's happened? It's the first
No.
time as far as the court
First time
knows?
it's happened.
All right. Thank you.
That one slipped by. All right, secondly, I received over the break 2 notes from jurors, and they are indicating that there are individuals, regular attendees, meaning the media persons, and they give me seat numbers who are constantly talking in the courtroom and who are causing them to have difficulty in hearing the testimony. And they have given me the seat numbers of the persons who were in the last session who were talking constantly and disturbing them. And I'm going to have Ms. Hazlett identify the 2 individuals, and those persons will be banned from further attendance at the court. All right, let's have the jury, please. Gentlemen, please be seated. Mr. Sims. Good morning again, sir. Mr. Harmon.
Thank you, Your Honor. In discussing the second subject of cross-contamination of samples when substrate controls were involved, we covered contamination by investigators and lab personnel. Is that right?
Yes.
And if the stains and the substrate controls were alternated systematically, would that provide a safeguard against cross-contamination?
Yes, it would.
And let's reflect back on the Comey article too, and remember the contaminated scissors attempting. Okay.
I assume this is foundational to
Yes,
something
Your
else.
Honor, for injecting substrate
Please.
controls in there. If one were to use, if a forensic scientist were to use contaminated scissors that were contaminated with a quantity of DNA and alternate between substrate controls and evidence stains, would that provide any kind of a safeguard against cross-contamination of samples?
Yes, it would, because again, the scissors would be used on a blood stain, and then if there was any contamination, that should then be transferred, if there was contamination, it would be transferred to this substrate control, which would very likely show that contamination, and then that would be monitored before one would proceed then to the next blood stain. So if that substrate control in the middle turns up clean, that indicates that there was no contamination detected.
Okay. Let me just clarify a point, too, about the Comey article. Have you had a chance to look at it again during the break?
Yes.
Okay. And if you would, the two areas where there was cross-contamination between stains, could you tell us more about what kind of contact, if any, those stains had, both the wet and the dry?
Well, the article indicates that the two stains were actually touching each other. They were actually stored together in a way that they're touching each other, and that's the important point, is that they're in physical contact.
Now let's shift to the third area, and that is contamination within the laboratory. We've already discussed contamination by lab personnel in sample preparation, and I think you talked about contamination by amplified product.
Yes.
Now, and you've previously discussed the concept of negative controls as a
Yes.
safeguard against contamination by PCR product.
Yes.
In addition to negative controls, and assuming they test clean, what are the implications of having substrate controls processed through the entire PCR process as a safeguard against contamination in the laboratory by amplified PCR product?
Yes, those substrate controls, if they had no DNA on them to begin with, would be most vulnerable to showing any contamination, whether it occurred from this handling effects, whether there was something in the laboratory, whether there was any PCR product contamination. And because they are treated in the same manner, they go through the entire process. And so that's an important control on the entire process, not just the collection, not just the extraction of the DNA, but all the way through the typing.
Okay. I'll strike that. You have actually, when you opened up all of the evidence in this case, have you documented the condition of the actual substrate controls that you previously enumerated when you talked about the results in this case?
Yes.
Okay. And do the substrate controls, are they all uniform in appearance for all the samples, all the substrate controls that you tested in this case?
No.
Is there a range in how they appear?
Yes, there is.
And when you sample those substrate controls, let's assume they're not uniform. Some are discolored. Some part is discolored. Some appears clean.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
In this case, if you saw a substrate control that parts of it were cleaner than others, what part did you sample to process through the entire PCR process?
Objection here is foundational with respect to making something hypothetical as opposed to specific. What he did.
Is the objection that it assumes facts that aren't in evidence yet?
All right, sure.
Sustained.
Did you sample all the substrate controls that you said you sampled in this case?
Yes?
Okay.
I think you asked him, did he document at the time of receipt, the substrate controls? And I guess the question would be, did he notice any differences between the substrates at that point?
Oh, I think I've asked a different question. I think I've moved on.
right.
And we'll come back. I haven't finished that area. Thank you, Your Honor. When you sampled the substrate controls, if one part of any of the control was dirtier, appeared dirtier than the other, which part did you sample?
Assumes facts aren't evidence
Sustained.
specific about the controls.
Were there any such?
Yes, there were, Your Honor.
Proceed.
And when you encountered such a substrate control, what did you do?
I took the dirtier, or what appeared to be the dirtier area in this case, as I can recall.
Why was that?
Well, I figured that probably received more of the environment. For example, if it was a sidewalk, it probably got better contact than maybe the other area of the substrate control.
And what would that, if that had happened, why would sampling the dirtier part of it have been important to you?
Well, that tells me that that's most likely the area that was most heavily, for example, may have some dirt or whatever is on that substrate, that I got a good area to test, in other words.
Okay, I'm going to direct your attention to just a couple of these substrate controls and see if you can describe how they appeared to you when you first observed them, okay?
Okay?
The substrate control for LAPD item 52, the drop out in the driveway at Bundy. Do you have an independent recollection of how that appeared when you observed it and ultimately sampled it?
That one in particular, I believe I do have an independent recollection of.
And what is that?
Well, my independent recollection was that it was sort of pinkish.
And is that the only one that was pinkish that you recall?
That's the only one I recall that was pinkish, yes.
In fact, were most of them absent of any coloration or
Sustained.
were most of them, did they appear clean to the naked eye?
Still leading.
How did most of them appear to the naked eye?
Most of them appeared as pieces of white fabric.
Is that unusual?
Objection.
Sustained.
foundation.
Sustained.
If you would, let's talk about substrate control 48C. If you'd like, I can direct your attention to a page in your notes. Do you recall how that appeared when you examined it?
Not without looking at my notes.
Would it help to refresh your recollection if you looked at page 48 of your notes?
Yes.
Okay. What's your recollection of how 48 appeared?
The 48 control was our item number DNA 22. I noted there was some dark debris specks associated with the cloth, and I took those also for the extraction process.
Okay. Do you recall what the control for item 50 looked like? The substrate control for item 50, which is farther back along the Bundy walkway.
Again, I'd have to look at my notes.
Would it help? It's on the same page there, 48.
Yes. I noted that it was a piece of whitish cloth with some brownish staining. I thought it may be some soiling.
Okay, and let's just shift to some others that look differently. For example, item 29, control. That's from the steering wheel of the Bronco.
Okay.
Would it help, do you remember what it looked like?
No.
Would it help to refresh your recollection if you looked at your notes on page 21?
Yes.
Okay, how did that appear?
That is generally just an irregularly shaped piece of white cloth.
Is that unusual to see a substrate control that looked like that?
No.
Okay. And do you have actually detailed notes of each and every other substrate control that you observe
Yes.
and photographs of them as well?
Yes.
And this is before you sample them?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Sims, let's move on, if you will. I'd like to discuss the subject of degradation of DNA and cross-contamination, if you will.
Okay.
I want to give you a hypothetical and ask you some questions about the hypothetical. The hypothetical is that all of the Bundy walkway stains were collected and they were packaged in plastic bags, and substrate controls were collected systematically, alternating between the substrate control and the evidence stain. They were packaged in plastic bags. They were put in a truck for several hours, and they were brought back to the Los Angeles Police Department laboratory. They were put in the same box with items that were collected from Mr. Simpson's residence, that were also collected systematically with substrate controls. For starters, is it possible?
This hypothetical in that form, I think it misstates the evidence and is compound.
Okay, we've already described the Comey article, and you've described how, at least based on study, it is possible to cross-contaminate samples. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you've described the conditions under which cross-contamination can occur.
Yes.
Now, in that study, none of those samples were degraded. Is that right?
In my understanding in that study is that those were good quality blood stains, yes.
Now, do you have an opinion about whether or not just the coexistence of those, and I'm sorry, let me withdraw that question. Let's assume that there were stains from Mr. Simpson's residence, which in fact were from him, contained his DNA, okay? Is it possible, scientifically possible, in your opinion, for those stains, merely by their coexistence in a room, for them to cross-contaminate one another?
Sustain. Phrase question.
These stains from two residences are collected along with their systematic substrate controls.
Okay.
They're brought into a room where they remain for a period of time. They're not in contact with one another. Okay, so far?
Okay.
Is it possible, based on that information alone, for those stains to have cross-contaminated one another?
I don't know about the rules on hypotheticals in terms of, but
You're speaking, counsel.
all right.
Is the objection foundation? That assumes facts that aren't in evidence.
Yes.
Right, that objection's overruled.
I'm
Proceed.
sorry?
Overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor. You may answer that question.
The question I would first have is how were those stains packaged at this point?
They were initially left in plastic bags. Actually, let's start off. They're in a box together,
Okay.
and they're in coin envelopes that are folded over, and they're in plastic bags in those coin envelopes that are folded over. Is it possible for those samples to cross-contaminate one another?
No, I would say no.
Okay. Let's move to the evidence room. Now, moving that box where you don't believe cross-contamination was possible into the evidence room, is it possible for those stains to have cross-contaminated one another and not cross-contaminated the substrate controls.
Foundational.
Sustain. You need some additional facts now that we're in the evidence processing room.
Excuse me, Your Honor?
You need some additional facts now that we're in the evidence
Sure.
processing room. It's also vague as to what stage.
And there are a lot of facts.
I've sustained the objection, counsel.
Okay. You've told us it's not possible, given that they're packaged up in a box in the truck.
Yes.
Okay. Does moving that box into a room and leaving it on the table, is it possible for those stains to have cross-contaminated one another?
That's testimony.
Under those conditions, no.
Okay. Now, let's assume that those stains are now processed for drying. Okay? And that,
Objection to strike vague on processing.
Overruled. He hasn't finished the question yet. I assume that that's next.
and that the processing for drying systematically alternates between the substrate controls and the evidence stains. And that
Objection to some facts, not evidence.
Sustained.
if one were to systematically alternate between the substrate controls and the evidence stains,
Objection to some facts, not evidence.
Overruled.
and that the substrate controls ultimately were processed along with those stains and produced no typable results. Is it your opinion that those samples were cross-contaminated at that point?
I,
Speculative, some facts, not evidence.
Overruled.
I would say there's certainly no evidence for that, and that I think those substrate controls would then provide a way of monitoring to show that that did not occur.
Let me add to that hypothetical that a known reference tube of Mr. Simpson's blood was kept in that room in a black plastic garbage bag. Okay?
Okay?
To the hypothetical you just answered. Is it possible for those samples to have been contaminated by that reference tube in the black plastic bag without contaminating the substrate controls?
No. I would follow that up that, in other words, you wouldn't get blood out of the plastic bag to begin with. That's the main point there.
Now, let me add to that. Let's accumulate to the next question. Let's assume that each and every stain that you tested in along the Bundy walkway was degraded to the point where you were unable to type with any of the PCR methods, okay?
Okay?
And just add that to the hypothetical I just asked you. Is it possible for cross-contamination to have occurred in that setting without cross-contaminating the substrate controls?
Well, again, I would give the same answer, that the substrate controls provide evidence that that did not occur.
Now, let's move on. Are you familiar with how the Los Angeles Police Department processes evidence stains and substrate controls for drying?
I have some information on that, yes.
And let's assume, or is that information that they use the tube drying method
Yes.
and place them back in the coin envelope
Yes.
and place the coin envelopes in a box?
That's my understanding, that it's a box so that they can now air dry, that the tubes can now air dry.
And place the box up on a metal shelf up on the wall?
Well, this is my general understanding. I've never seen the actual room.
Let's talk about the qualities of DNA. Now, we've got everything drying up in the tubes, and assume it's dried overnight.
Okay?
Okay? Have you seen photographs of what DNA looks like, powerful microscopic photographs?
Well, there are, yes, and they're very, very powerful microscopes. You can see the motion of DNA, for example, or
Now, can DNA fly?
I don't think so.
I mean, there are no scientific studies that have shown that, are there?
No, I don't think it has wings.
How about if it's from a bird? Can it fly?
I don't think that makes any difference.
Does the DNA of an athletic person that's in a stain have any athletic prowess more than a dead person?
Sustain.
I'm-
Sustain. Sustain. Curious to disregard the tenor of that question. Proceed.
Are you aware of any scientific studies that show that DNA can come to life at night?
Objection.
Sustain.
Is it possible for the samples to have been cross-contaminated up on the shelf, in the box, in the coin envelopes, in those tubes?
Again, I would answer that the substrate controls provide the monitor to ensure that that didn't occur.
Now, I believe you discussed, and I'm getting close to the end here, Mr. Sims. I believe you discussed, I think you, in discussing some of your sample processing, you mentioned you bleach your rulers. Is that right?
Yes.
And I think you also said, what do you wipe your tools with when you're doing evidence processing?
I do three things. I do a water wash down under the tap. Then I wipe it with a chem wipe. Then I do an ethanol rinse and wipe that off. And then finally I flame them over a Bunsen burner flame, a very hot flame.
Now, what kind of tools are we talking about?
Generally, that would be a pair of scissors, small scissors, and a forceps or like tweezers.